we're here to talk about the budget and about, whether we're going to have enough money to do the things that the state wants to do, what's going to get cut, what's going to get used. And I'll just kind of go down the row really quickly and say, what do you expect the budget outlook to be? That we don't have a revenue estimate from the controller yet. We do know that we're going to have, probably after a supplemental bill, zero cash. Last session we had $6 or $8 billion. This time we're going to start with zero cash, lower revenue prospects, and all the stuff that we want.
Well, that sounds like a business cycle to me, and and clearly we're in a business cycle that's in a downturn, and you can see that now in Houston. We've had negative sales tax growth for over a year and a half, and so we have not seen the bottom to our sales tax numbers, which means that we're kind of a boat anchor on the entire state at this point. So I guess I would view this session as going back to those that have raised teenage sons or daughters know that sometimes no is just as good an answer as yes, and we're going to be saying no to a lot of requests in this legislative session.
You want to dive into that?
Yeah, I'll come at it from a couple of angles. First, I do think that this is going to be one of those sessions where we're going to go in, and people have heard me say it before, we only go into a legislative session in one of two ways on the budget. There's only two ways you can look at the budget if you're going into a session. One is, we're broke, we can't spend any money. The other is, someday we could be broke, we can't spend any money.
I missed that last one, Kurt.
And this is one of those where everybody's going to be screaming, we're broke. Part of that is of the legislature's own doing. In 2015, we slashed the franchise tax in such a way that it's like we forgot 2011. 2011 was a real downtime. We forgot 2006 when the franchise tax was created to broaden the tax and have more people paying on it, so we could provide property tax relief and things like that. But that's just one example of something we've done that has added to what I consider to be a structural deficit with regard to public education. The other thing is, I voted against the bill. I was one of only two senators to vote against the bill when it first came to the floor. Some protections were put in on the transportation matter, where sales tax is now going to eat up. We're going to have about $5 billion eaten up for transportation, an entitlement for transportation that's going to make a difference on what we're able to do in this budget.
We've semi-dedicated money to transportation.
It's not semi-dedicated. I mean, you can get it back with a 2/3 vote, and both, and that's only half of it, by the way, that you can get back. I frankly look back on that vote. I should have stayed with my first vote. I look back on that with regret, because here we are faced with a situation where we're now going to have a tighter budget because we've created an entitlement for something I care about, but we need new money to deal with that.
Yeah, well, totally on board with what Senator Watson's saying. This was self-inflicted to a large extent. There's no question that all of us want to reduce taxes. That's something that I think everybody comes in thinking if we can do that, that's wonderful. But we've been focused so much on that we've lost sight of the big picture of how we're actually going to pay for the services that will allow our state to continue to grow and have a strong economy. And the tax cuts that were made last time through the reduction in the franchise tax and through the increased property tax homestead exemption, which is a good thing. We know that we needed to find some relief there. But both of those revenue streams equaled close to $4 billion, I think, Drew. And both of those revenue streams are for public education. So we're coming into this session with $4 billion less that was already funneled into public education, and we know we need to increase our funding for public education. And then the constitutional amendment to help fund transportation. We heard the speaker earlier this morning talking about the growth of our state, and we count on an increased tax base to help us pay for the growth of the state. Well, by dedicating the funding to transportation, which was needed, we've again limited what we have available to pay for that growth, because we've dedicated that growth basically to transportation. So I don't subscribe to the fact that we don't have enough money. We certainly have a robust economic stabilization fund and other things that we can look into. The Medicaid expansion issue. So I don't think it's as dire as some would suggest, but it's going to require that we, become adults and get in there and look at what's really going on and be honest and transparent about what's happening and pay for the things that Texans expect us to pay for.
What's your overview of this thing?
Absolutely. I will digress to a biblical example. Somebody in the past fed multitudes with very few loaves and very few fishes. And I think we're going to have less loaves and less fishes to feed the multitudes the next biennium moving forward. Again, some of that is baked into a very conservative budget and legislative policies that we've had over a number of biennium that have basically come home to roost right now. Some of it is consequential in that we are still dependent upon the oil and gas industry. Our oil and gas severance taxes are down about 60%. Our state sales taxes associated with the oil and gas industry is down 31%. Again, property valuations for oil and gas properties is down about 25%. And so we're going to have to work through this down cycle, as Senator Betancourt has said, and prepare for the next biennium. Now, there's work to be done in the current biennium. We have about a $2 billion supplemental needs. We're going to have about $1.3 billion in Medicaid caseload growth. We'll have about $600 million in school foundation growth, TDCJ, healthcare. We obviously have supplemental needs for DFPS and foster care, and all of that will amount to a little over $2 billion. The good news is we have about $2.7 billion in cash available to pay it. We're still under the spending cap limit of about $2.7 billion. So we have some flexibility, but in the end, we're going to begin the budget with a whole lot less money than we've had in the past. And altogether, when you look at the dedication for transportation, you look at the homestead exemption, when you look at the margins tax reduction, when you look at all the decisions we've made in the last 3 biennium or more, then that means that we begin basically $8 to $9 billion less than we had the last biennium. So we're going to have to do more with less.
Let's talk about some of the things that are happening indirectly. I mean, some of the direct things that you talked about, transportation and things like that. There's sort of a, one way I think of the budget is Homer Simpson sitting in front of all of those gauges at his nuclear plant, and he's looking at all of those dials. And if every one of those was a state agency or a program, a lot of those dials are redlined right now. Child Protective Services, foster care, a bunch of those things. How expensive is all of that going to be? The things that are kind of happening to the legislature in the sense that this is an emergency now you have to deal with. It's going to cost X.
Well, obviously, we're going to have to deal with it. I think it's a priority of the legislature. I know it's a priority with everyone on this panel, that we're going to have to create the same sense of urgency to protect the children that come under the care and control of this state, under our foster care and DFPS system, child care system. I think if we consider the border security a priority, then by gosh, we ought to consider the children of Texas a priority too. And so I see this state meeting that need and obligation. I know there's current initiative on the table for approval, and it's about to be approved to go ahead and hire new investigators and go ahead and give pay raises. I know these folks up here have been very on the cutting edge and leading edge of that discussion, and so I see that as we're moving in a supplemental budget to meet that need.
Let me add something. It's very important for the audience to know that Senator Watson is on a work group that the Senate Finance Committee Chair Jane Nelson started. Chairman Schwartner, I think, is the chair of it, and they're looking at Child Protective Services. Now, I want to make sure everybody understands that what we saw in the hearings, by any standard, tells me that the executive management of that agency over the last couple of years has been a mess, okay? Now, I say a mess because I want the conservatives in the audience and the liberals to hear me both, okay? That this is a classic example of we're not spending our money wisely. Now, At one point in time, I had to stop the new director 3 times to ask a simple question. Do you have a salary compensation study underway? First time I didn't get a response. I got a very emotional response, but not the question we needed to hear. And then I asked it again, got another emotional response. And then the third time, I just opened it up to anybody in the audience, you know, Commissioner Smith, anybody on the staff. Can somebody tell me that this agency that has real trouble has taken the proactive step in the last decade of putting out and working on a salary compensation study? And I finally got an answer, okay? But this is an example of what happens when agencies get, you know, really, they lose track of their base mission. Their mission is to protect kids, but also we've got, as taxpayers, want to know that the money is being spent wisely. Now, we've got caseworkers that are killing themselves at the base unit level trying to get, you know, actions happening. But the responses of upper management were unacceptable to everybody on the committee. And it's unacceptable because they simply aren't getting the job done.
So do you see this as a management and budget problem, or just a management problem?
I think it's a management and a budget problem. Because look, without zero-based budgeting, I can't tell if that agency is doing the right thing or not. It's one of the great weaknesses we have in Texas budgets is we never go back and decide, are we doing the right things? And quite frankly, I'll kick it to Senator Watson. I thought the responses were just devastatingly appalling at the times.
Well, yeah, I think we all know there's a mess, and there's things that need to be fixed, management on down. But we cannot lose sight of the fact. I know we like to do this, and it's one of the MOs in the legislature is to well, actually there are 2 involved in this. One is to say you can't throw money at it and fix it. There's got to be a fix in here somewhere. So, you know, it's the old Reagan story about going into the room full of manure, and the guy's such an optimist, he keeps digging and digging. He says, what are you doing? He says, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere, right? Well, that's not the whole answer here. The other thing that is done all the time at the legislature is unless a court tells the legislature you have to do something, then it won't do it. Right. Well, in this case, as you deal with all of the children, you deal with the foster care part of this, we have a court that has ruled that our system is unconstitutional. And the court appointed 2 special masters that have now issued their report on what needs to happen. The judge ain't gonna care about us saying we don't have the money for it. In some instances, we have lost our ability to play the games that the legislature typically plays and say things like, oh, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere, or this is just a mismanagement, or I don't agree. It's not going to be a debate between the Senate and the House on some of this stuff. It's going to be the court telling us what we have to do. And I agree with Drew that we just need to get on that horse, right? We just need to do it. I think the first thing we ought to do is look at that special master report and talk about what we're going to do right now to deal with the budgetary fixes that we need to do at CPS.
But I'll tell you, Senator, this is my first term, and I can't tell you from my business experience how poor of a hearing that they had. Do you agree?
No, yeah, we need to fix it.
Right. Now,
but we need to not play the game that I know we like to play and say it doesn't take any more money. It's going to take more money.
Okay, but your work group is recommending more money, but I'm also trying to make sure the audience recognizes this. There is no fact or supposition of the fact that was a well-managed agency over the last 10 years. We have to be able to recognize that and just come out and say it. I don't know what games have been played in the legislature that you're referring to, but I guarantee you that Senate Finance hearing was not a game, because senator after senator, both political parties, was absolutely, disappointed is an understatement from what we heard. Because we had an agency with 6,000 caseworkers that had a computer model that would tell them what to do, that was hopelessly outdated, and 6,000 caseworkers couldn't find 511 priority 1 kids and it's just a miracle that those kids weren't in severe trouble or had already been deceased.
And I want Don to speak. One thing,
Senators.
part of the
Allow
problem.
the House to speak.
Yes, but I want to point out something. When he says it's horribly outdated, that's not just a management problem. Right now, we know from DIR that 50% of the computers in state government are outdated and are not kept up. That's our failure to provide them with the funding. I'm sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Chairman.
From the House?
But, you know, speaking to both senators' concerns, it is about the money, but yet, because of the past management practices, we're going to have some performance measures tied to this money. It just cannot be a wholesale deposit of money in the agency. There has to be some controls that will make sure that they are achieving the goals that we want: caseload growth, regionalization, making sure that the hires are made with this money, that this money is not being used for other purposes within the agency. It's got to be used and directed to hiring the people to meet the needs of these children. And so I think, speaking to both of your concerns, it is about the money, but it's also about the way for the legislature to keep control over the money, to make sure it's being used for the purposes we say it should be used, and that there are controls that will allow us to do that, and performance measures associated with that.
This is a nice segue to another agency. 2 years ago, you had, go ahead, sorry.
Thank you. The fact is, and I agree with a lot of what everyone has said, but this is not a new issue. We have been hearing from the agency for a long, long time, for years, about the problems here. I agree that we need to spend the money more effectively and efficiently here. But at the same time, this all came about, I will propose anyway, quite frankly, because of the media. The media is our oversight watchdog right now. The media, with a part-time legislature, is who brings these issues to our attention. The urgency with which this was addressed came about after reports of horrific conditions occurring with children. This is not new. This has been happening. We've been hearing about it, but it rose to a level of urgency because it was in our faces. And the fact is that the people who have been running these agencies are people who are appointed by our governor. If there's a problem with management, talk to the governor.
Now let's take to the other thing.
Okay, segue.
So the segue is, 2 years ago, you guys had plenty of money, and you did throw money at a problem, and you did it without a lot of accountability. I'm talking about $800 million for border security. Are you going to come back and say, this time, here's $800 million more? Are you going to come back, as you, I guess, have already started to do, and say, what did we get for our $800 million? What are you proposing that we get next time? Are you going to be able to apply that $800 million to something else this time? Anybody?
Well, I'll start. I asked a whole lot of questions about the $800 million last time because, again, one of the things that happens in the legislature is when something becomes the pretty item or the politically correct item, it gets the money that it asked for. And that's what happened. There were really no standards put in place. It's beyond my comprehension that what we will do is throw more money, to use the phrase, throw more money at it without a full and thorough report of what we got for the money the first time,
right,
and what we will get in addition for any money that they're asking. The hearing on that bugged me greatly when we talk about hearings, because you could ask the questions and they pretty much were open about, we don't know what standards you can use, and some of this you're just going to have to go on faith. Well, okay, some of it maybe we do need to, but not the way we did. So my hope is that we have the same sort of thorough vetting of a pet project that we're saying we need to have for things like taking care of kids.
Okay, border security, I would not, with all respect to my esteemed colleague, not consider it to be a pet project. It was a project that we needed to do, okay? Now, I don't think there's any appetite for increasing the money that's going to be, if I can just say as an economic conservative, with the change in administration in Washington, I would hope that we could be able to roll back that money, because if the Trump administration is going to take the bull by the horns and do the work that they should have been doing on the border, then we should be able, over time, be able to pull back on those resources. I also don't see, at this point in time, any ability to come in and say that we need to spend more money than we did in the last session. But that's just one senator's, rational view of at this point in time. Okay, or at least in my little world, it's a rational view, right? Self-declared rational view, right?
But we were looking at, on the House side, we had a committee on looking at the fiscal impacts prior to last session, and clearly saw that the data that we were given showed the effectiveness if they had more arrests because they were catching the guys, or they had less arrests because they were deterring the guys in the first place. It didn't matter how we looked at it. We were being told that it was a working program. And the House, with a lot of things in the budget, we came up with a slightly larger increase, but nowhere near what the Senate was proposing. But ultimately, in the end, the Senate's proposal went out in the final budget.
I'm hopeful that if we stand up federal troops along the border and customs agents, that we'll be able to pull our troopers back and pull our game wardens back and give them back to the areas of the state that need their protection. I, for one, will look very strongly at simply maintaining the trooper level that we have, paying for those troopers that we've already hired. I will, sitting where I am today, I'd be very reluctant to give any more money for equipment. No more planes, no more helicopters, no more video, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I would be very, from my standpoint, hopefully the federals will bring in resources and it will allow us to pull back our resources.
Does it stay at 800 or does it come down this time?
I think to fund the existing troopers is a whole lot less money than that. I mean, you're looking at, I don't know, this is completely off the cuff, but I would say it'd probably be in the 200.
I think, Representative Darby, you're talking about one-time expenses because there were some major equipment expenses that they bought.
We bought aircraft and helicopters and 4,000 video cameras and gunboats and all kinds of stuff. And I'm certainly reluctant to commit those kind of resources again.
Okay. Let's talk about expensive wishes. Tax cuts probably fall into this, whether you're cutting property taxes or you're cutting franchise taxes. I know there's a proposal to do that, or to at least start scaling those things back, to do more of the kinds of things, Senator Watson, that you were talking about, we have already done to the budget. Is there a taste for that in the legislature, and is there the money to do those things? Can you cut, or can you do some of those expensive things? Let's just start with you since you brought it up first.
Sure. Well, let's talk property taxes. By the way, I think that I'm going to come at this question. I'm not going to answer it directly because I think the direct answer is, in the legislature, there's always an appetite for cutting.
Right.
But now, having answered it that way, let's talk about what we've really done. When I was talking earlier about a structural deficit, back in 2006, when there was a property tax cut done from roughly $1.50 to $1 per $100 valuation, the answer to that was to expand the franchise tax. That was the big part. There were other things like cigarette tax and liar's affidavit. But the franchise tax, at the time, people were told that won't cover the hole you're creating with property taxes. And that proved to be right. And I won't go through all the history, but now what we've done is we've added to that structural deficit. The obligation for public education is an obligation of the state of Texas. And what happens is, in the formula, as property values go up and property taxes then go up because of the property values, the state's share goes down. If you look at TEA's LAR, they're even counting on a 5% increase in property values to save the state $2 billion. In Austin, Texas, the average homeowner is paying about $1,300 to $1,400 just for recapture.
Right.
And that's going to the state to fund state obligations. We have got to look at how we're doing our school finance system so that we can do right by the people in this state and have a fair and equitable system. The cut in the franchise tax put more of a burden on property taxes because you now, that $2.6 billion cut could have been for the property tax relief fund, could have been used in that way. So we've got, I'm pleased to hear the speaker talking about how we would be remiss if we didn't take up school finance. I'm a little disappointed we're not talking more about it right now.
Can I say something now? Last session, Chairman Otto and Chairman Darby and others on appropriations, we did actually look at the dollars that were coming in from the increased values and plugged them back into education. I think at the very least we need to do that again this session, but I would suggest more on top of that. You know, Kirk talks about what happened in 2006, 2007, when we swapped out state revenue for some of the local property taxes. That brought the state's share from, I think it was about 33% prior to that, to when the swap occurred, it got us back up to about 48% of the share of the cost of public education was coming from the state. Right. It has continued to erode since then as property values have gone up, so that now we're back to, I think it's around 42%.
42 or 3.
That's right.
Is what the state's share of public education is. And depending on your philosophy, most of us think that the state's got a primary responsibility here for public education. Let's just say it's at least 50-50. I have filed a constitutional amendment that was actually filed several sessions ago and didn't even get a hearing from Bert Solomons that requires the state maintain a 50% share. If we want to impact our local property taxes, then the surest way to do it is to swap state revenue for what's coming in at the local property tax level. That will actually put a hold on the growing impact of property taxes. But let me also just real quickly mention that when I looked at the numbers here of what 2017's budget is for public education, and as I said, the share of the state is about 42%. I looked at what would it be, what would it cost us to get our share using current dollars up to 50%? And a biennial cost would be like $4.5 billion. Well, look back to what we did last session with the almost $4 billion tax cuts that most people didn't even see. We could have funded the state's investment in public education and almost gotten us back up to 50%. We have a way to do this. I don't know what it is yet. I'm going to be looking for it. But the surest way to have a governor, if you will, on our property taxes that continue to rise to pay for public education is to have the state's share be more, and this is just one solution that might be considered.
Okay. I'm going to speak for the taxpayers.
You're shaking your head.
I'm shaking my head. First off, every homeowner in the state saw something, okay? In Harlingen, Texas, where we went down to have a hearing, the reason why they had a tax cut of all the places in the state was because of that homestead exemption. So Representative Howard, they saw it, it was real, and the poorest part of the state paid less in property taxes as a result, and it's a good thing.
What was the number? What was some of the?
It was $126, but that was enough.
On a $220,000 home?
No, because they have home values down there of $85,000,
And they got
$88,000,
$126?
and $100,000. If you've been to the committee hearings, or I can send you a
watched some of them.
Okay, then you'd know that when you have a low socioeconomic area, like $110,000 or less, that cut really helped them. Now,
it did.
let me explain
I don't doubt that.
again. Well, we know, but we keep saying that the $4 billion is terrible. It's terrible. No, it's not. I have 30,000 layoffs in my district in Houston. That franchise tax reduction of 25% is letting some of those businesses survive another year. We need businesses to hire people. We can't just decide, oops, government's got a need, and thou shalt force the taxpayers to pay. That's not how it's supposed to work. The taxpayers' ability to pay must come into this. Now, out of that $4.05 billion, Chairman Darby knows that $250 million was occupational taxes, which the cost of compliance was nearly exactly what we were getting from that little revenue stream. Now, that means people that had licenses don't have to waste their time dealing with a state agency and sending a check for $100 or $75 or whatever. Now, tax cuts, in this case of $4.05 billion, were a good thing. Now today, we're going to release Senate Bill 2. My committee is going to come out with a report, and we're going to talk about controlling the rate of increase of property taxes. We've got a lot of good, we got a lot of good appraisal reforms, because one of the things we heard was that taxpayers are being treated terribly in some appraisal districts. We have record tape of a gentleman coming to a hearing. He goes up to a counter and asks a question. He ends up in handcuffs and his face pushed against a window because he was asking questions. Now, when we get to that point, that means we've got an adversarial property tax system that needs to be fixed. So we're going to lower the rollback rate. We're going to get oversight over appraisal districts, and we're going to control the increases of property taxes, because in Austin and Houston, we're setting records.
Isn't it the state's fault, though? I mean,
It is
according
the
to the
state's fault.
according to the LBB, in the last 10 years, the state's share, or the state's funding per student, has dropped by $379 in real dollars.
Okay.
The state's
Wait,
spending
wait,
that much
wait.
less per student. If they were spending that much more, wouldn't you have less pressure on local school property?
But remember, school taxes
Well,
is
yes or
just,
no, wouldn't
no, because it's a more complicated formula than that. Okay?
That we won't look at.
No. Now, Kurt. Now,
We've
sorry,
not looked
no.
at the cost of education index since the 90s. The transportation allotment was created in 1987, I think, 1984.
It's been last adjusted in
1987.
91.
And, yeah, and really hadn't been touched since that point in time. We refuse to look at it. So if we look at your proposal, and let's use Austin, because I happen to know a little bit about Austin. If you look at Austin, your proposal, they've done the math on it, would amount to about a $38 savings. Okay, that's real, $38 real money. I'll categorize that as real money. It's costing the Austin Independent School District taxpayer $1,300 on that same house for recapture alone. 36% of the AISD, of somebody living in AISD, 36% of their tax bill is recapture alone. We have to address it. You don't get to be both the victim and the perpetrator.
No, but I'll tell you this, okay, the victim is the Texas taxpayer. Austin has seen 3 years of 12% appraised value increases. It's not just schools they pay the county and the city. Now, your county government will cut its rate. Gee, it's a majority Democrat county. I'm very happy to hear that. The city refuses to, and their tax levy has increased 4 times faster than median household income. They have the highest increase in city government of any government in the state of Texas, period.
Well,
Now, so let's get back to where the victim is. The victim is the taxpayer, because here's what their tax bill says. I send money to the schools, I send money to the county. I send money to the city, I send money to community colleges. I send money to special districts, I send money to hospital districts. The average tax bill in an urban area has 9 lines on it, okay? Now, you and I are
And the
also the
biggest
only
is
2
the
people.
state's
Okay,
school
all right,
system.
you and I are the most 2 outspoken members about the fact that we're balanced the state budget off of the increase in the Student Foundation School Program. True or false?
I think that's true.
Right, because we mention that at every finance committee hearing when it comes up. Okay?
Hold on one second.
All right.
While they're screaming at each other, you guys can line up at the mics. Go ahead, commence.
I'm trying very hard not to.
All right.
Yeah, we're going to go to
Now-
audience questions, but go ahead.
Okay, now,
In
now
fact,
if we
in fact, my beard was brown when I sat down.
Yeah, and now it's not. But he can't play Santa Claus because I'm gaining weight, he's losing it. All right, now, okay, so where we're at with this is that we need to control the increases of special districts, like municipal utility districts, which have a 92% increase in tax levies in 10 years. Oh, did I mention counties have an 82% increase in tax levies in 10 years? Oh, did I mention cities? Well, Austin would drag the number up, but it only went to 71% because they have sales tax. So we have to look at the taxpayer's ability to pay.
Let me jump in. My daddy always said, "Don't jump into a dog fight." And so,
Here you are.
but anyway, you know, the reality is the state does not collect any property taxes, and so when you look at reducing or eliminating further the margins tax, my question is simply, what are we going to fill the hole with? I think it's a huge hole. It keeps getting bigger, and so the question I have, we all would like to have property tax relief. We all would like to have margins tax relief. All those are unpopular, but the reality is we have to fund essential governmental services. I consider public education to be the #1 priority of this state. And so,
At the risk of opening up a new can of snakes, I'd like to ask about another tax other than property. Senator, you talked about basing taxes on ability to pay, and I think a lot of people are concerned about that. I know a lot of legislators talk about not determining winners and losers in state policy and support efficiency in tax collection. So the largest state revenue source is sales taxes.
Right.
And for decades, there's been a significant decision whether
Can you cut to your question?
to collect sales tax in the goods economy and ignore the service economy. I wonder, number one, are legislators aware of that? And number two, for those who are, if there's any thought to dealing with that. Thank you.
Look, there's been economic theory about lowering sales tax and broadening it for a long time. That's been part of conservative mantra for many years. Now, when you look at the budget, but just remember this: as much as there's obviously a lot of support for education dollars, what's our #1 item going to be on the budget this time that we're going to vote on? Health and Human Services. It's going to eclipse education in this budget for the first time. And that's not, and by the way, we made at the time what was a controversial decision, but now in the rearview mirror, it looks really good, because when the governor of Minnesota says that Obamacare, or the Affordable Health Care Act, is unaffordable and unsustainable in Minnesota, then we probably made a good decision passing on that act until we get the new act that comes out. But even with us passing on Obamacare, the budget is now majority Health and Human Services. You just need to know, because that's where your spending is going right now.
That's because we have more poor people, for one thing.
Do you, really quick answer on this, do you expect the federal government to be able to move quickly enough on any of this stuff that it'll affect the budget you guys are writing?
I
In the
don't
next
think
5
so.
months? Okay.
I think, at best, we may make 1 year out decisions that
Right.
we need to go ahead and fund programs 1 year out, but then maybe perhaps allow the second year to be handled in
Because block grants might actually show up
Yeah.
in the second year. We'll see.
And the only thing I would add to that is I completely agree. I would hope we would get some quick guidance on things like the 1115 Medicaid transformation waiver, because
Because that's critical.
yeah, and time sensitive.
Yes, sir.
So Houston ISD just voted down the recapture, which means that it's putting the legislature in sort of an unprecedented place, in that unless you kick the can down the road, as has happened in past sessions except for 2015, detachment will be what happens, and that'll have a significant impact on major commercial property owners in the Houston area, and also I think raises some federal constitutional issues as well as state constitutional issues. What I know that there needs to be, and Senator Taylor talked about major public education reform as far as financing goes. What role do you think you guys will play in that discussion? Because I think they sort of go hand in glove, and you're also getting to a critical mass point where, HISD is now in recapture, which means it's Dallas ISD, and pretty soon everyone will be a wealthy school district. So can y'all talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'll just say that HISD will not be recaptured. That's part of the issue here.
Right.
They're going to have de-annexation, which is what.
That's what I meant, the detachment.
Yeah, so the TEA is going to have to do that. Certainly, it's something that puts it more up front and center to us by the choice that the voters made there. I don't know if it's going to force the legislature to do anything differently than we've done before. But clearly, and I'm really glad to hear what Senator Taylor had to say about looking at a different way of maybe doing this. The fact is that we have continued to push more and more on the local property taxpayers. The property taxes have, whether they have escalated for
Whatever reason.
yeah, but the fact is the market is the market, and they have escalated. So, I think that it's going to be difficult to see what happens here with Houston, but the fact is that by losing a significant portion of their tax base.
$18 billion.
$18 billion. It's going to, their
$18.1
debt
billion.
service is now going to be spread over the
Okay.
remaining taxpayers, which is going to increase the amount that they owe.
And
So
that's a 2-penny tax increase. It's another 18 million they lose. Now, I'm just going to call HISD out. The trustees were irresponsible. When they took that vote, they did not get on the phone and call Representative Howard, Representative Darby, or the senators. They just had an emotional reaction. Now, 3 of them have already resigned to go do something else. Literally, I'm not making this up. Now, when you have a board that decides to cut off their nose to spite their face, which is what they did, because when they made that vote, now the education commissioner, under a law that's written long ago in a galaxy far away, okay? I think Scott Hogg
Actually,
probably
just a
wrote
few
it.
blocks.
Yeah, just right. Well,
That galaxy's not too far
yeah,
away.
it's not too far. The education commissioner has no choice but to de-annex their property. And that's $18 billion to downtown Houston that's going to go elsewhere. Now, and what's sad about it is there was never even discussion. There was just an emotional play. Well, they made a play and they told their public to do the wrong thing, and the public voted with the misinformed data because their trustees are telling them to vote no on recapture. Now, I think they'd had a lot more standing with the legislature if they said, we'll vote yes on recapture, can you help us, okay? Because the sad part about it is they had not one conversation that I can track, and I've got precincts in HISD in my district, and we can't track one conversation they had before they decided to go vote no. They, in my opinion, didn't even know what Representative Howard said, that they were going to lose their own debt rate. And in fact, the Chronicle, when they wrote their editorial against it, they didn't know that either. So if we're going to go out and basically light a big campfire and then throw gasoline on it, let's figure out what we're doing before we throw the gasoline on the fire.
I got time for one.
But 2 wrongs don't make a right, and we're being irresponsible if we don't fix this at the state level.
But the public,
I got time
public
for
outcry, my school districts in West Texas have been operating under recapture
For a long time.
20 plus years.
Right.
And there was no hue and outcry for that for the city, for Andrews County and other school districts that have been having to pay and remit checks to the state. It's only when Houston, now has to write a check.
Right.
Is obviously Austin ISD has been having to write a check
Right.
for a number of years. So, I think it needs to be addressed, certainly, but, just because Houston comes under the terms of recapture now doesn't mean that we have to do something.
We have time for one
precipitously.
quick question.
Well, it's actually more of a statement. My name's Debbie Clark.
Well, I need a question. I need a question.
Well, there's data that was not mentioned during the discussion. I just want to make sure it gets out there. Austin Independent School District has over 60% economically disadvantaged kids. So we have high property taxes, but we don't get to keep the money to help those kids.
Right.
I want to make sure that gets out there.
Right.
HISD is in the same boat. It's
They have
75%.
80% low social economic.
Right.
Okay, all right.
So that's why these formulas need to be changed.
Right.
If Senator Taylor thinks they need to be simplified, great.
Sure.
But don't assume because we're a rich district, we can't keep it to help those kids.
It's a
Is there
dysfunctional
sufficient,
system.
is there sufficient political pressure on the legislature without a court ruling to change those formulas, whether it was HISD or Austin or anybody else?
I've been very pleased that the speaker has included this in his agenda and has indicated that he would like for us to look at things like the weights, look at some of the things that we might need to alter that could, whether we can have a full-fledged redo of the system, I don't know. Like I said, I was pleased to hear Senator Taylor talk about that. But yes, there are some things I think that we have leadership telling us that we need to do.
But here's where the outcry should have been. Kashmir High School was left on the improvements required list for 7 years, and HISD did nothing. That means that a generation or half a generation of kids went through that in a school that should have been closed by state definition. And then to top it off, when the TEA sends in their conservator, they find out that there's not a single person certified to teach math at a high school in Texas. Now, we can say, oh, HISD is making this issue, to the forefront. I agree with Representative Darby. There's been a lot of other districts that have gone through this for a lot longer, okay? And when I see districts that have improvements required on high schools, the longest in the state, no other school has ever been on a list for 7 years, then we have to think, what are we doing in that governance of that school district?
Okay, I got to call time. Drew Darby, Donna Howard, Kirk Watson, Paul Betancourt. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. We got about 10 minutes here before the next panel.
Oh, you could have done 5 more minutes of questioning.